We're gonna just begin to get started. I got a question for everybody.
Okay.
As we begin to get started this morning. And it's a question that I've used for several years as we begin to think about our study of plant science. And I want you to just pick out a scrap piece of paper because we're going to talk about this a little bit, but I'm going to ask you two questions. Just scrap paper, it doesn't matter. I'm just doing this to give you an opportunity to think about it. The first question, have you been affected by plants today in any way? And the second question is how? Give you 2 or 3 minutes to think about that and write down the answer to those two things, and then we're going to talk about it.
Trip, right? That's what you do, right? Flint.
I was as soon as I woke up.
Good one thing.
Tom, can you switch your camera from the front of your room to the,
Yes, I can.
so I can see your people?
I can do that.
You got people moving.
Yes, I do.
Like, down here. That's fine. Like upgraded. Okay.
That helps. That helps a lot.
Okay. It'll help better if I can like move the camera. That's supposed to have that option.
That's just fine. All right, we'll start with some of the folks in your room there. Have any of you been affected by plants today?
Yes.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. And how?
Many ways. I can list off a couple.
Yes.
One way I think of is all the trees around help clean the air I breathe. Another way, if you're looking more towards produce, is the plants that grew the cocoa beans to end up making my coffee this morning. It's fabulous.
Okay. Anybody else?
I was thinking of breakfast as well.
That's a good one. That's one of the things. When I initially did this in the classroom that we had here, I got the most blank expression, and they said, "No, we haven't had any effective plants today." And I asked, "Well, how many of you had breakfast?" Then they began to realize what we were talking about. Anybody else have another reaction or effect?
Yes.
What?
This morning, I went outside by the fountain pond, the strip, and I just looked around and saw trees. I saw a rose bush, a certain type of flower that was like a bright pinkish red color. Not sure what it is. And just taking all that in made me feel calm.
Yeah. Okay. All right, we got the Daniels campus up in the screen now. What about you guys? Any of you all affected by plants in any way?
I said breakfast.
Okay. Anybody else?
Just today?
It doesn't have to be just today. Just all right. Let me ask you a question. How many of you drove to campus or used some sort of motor vehicle to get there?
Yes.
I get that open everybody.
There's mandated a 10% ethanol in the gasoline that you use to get there, and that's a plant product. That's a little bit of an extreme situation, but that too is a plant effect. Any of you have any allergies?
Yes.
Pollen allergies?
Well, and they own horses and shit.
You were negatively affected by it.
Yeah.
Uh, any of you had any meat with your breakfast? That ham or bacon or sausage or whatever that might have been, chicken, was fed plant product to get it to that size. So, Tyler, what was your
Mine was pollen.
pollen? Okay. And you're eating pretzels, which again are a plant product. So, as we begin to talk about the effects of plants, it's a much larger thing than just sitting here thinking about an individual plant or crop, because we're dealing with all of these things in a conglomerate. So it's a large thing we talk about. Most of the farming industries are a product of plants one way or another, whether it's a direct sale of a plant or a feeding of an animal. It's again an introduction to plants. So, now, go ahead.
I'll talk about your drink last weekend.
I can drop red milkshakes.
Okay, the first chapter in the textbook begins to talk about the history of plants a little bit. And we won't spend a tremendous amount of time on that, but we've got a lot of terminology and definitions that we need to make sure that you are aware of. And one of them is the term angiosperm. Angiosperms are plants that produce flowers and seeds, and they are used throughout the world and throughout the 150 million years that we've been in existence. It talks about the nomadic hunters and gatherers and how they herded their animals and gathered plant materials for food to enable them to begin their civilization and their survival. Then, as a part of the history of plants, we begin to use the term cultivation. And cultivation was first believed to have been done in the Middle East and in Africa, as those folks began to use plants to their advantage. They would cultivate plants and try to increase the volume of food and plant materials that they had in a given area, which reduced the need for them to travel from one area to another. So the fact that they were cultivating plants greatly increased their likelihood of survival. As we move forward, you're going to realize that we spend a lot of time, particularly in the early part of this class, talking about different definitions of things. And as we move along, the term agronomy comes up, and we also talk about horticulture. But agronomy is the study of field-grown crops, such as wheat, soybean, corn, forages, and certain plants that are used for industrial uses. Agronomy is a study. It's a study of those field-grown crops. In Southside, you have a lot more of an agronomic or a study of or a type of agronomy-based culture than what we do in this area. because of the volume of soybeans, corn, wheat, and tobacco that you grow. Here, we're a little bit more of a horticultural nature because we grow more fruit crops and things of that type. Horticulture studies that crops are intensive or constant care, which means we're talking about fruit crops or ornamental crops. An example of the horticultural crops would be peaches, apples, grapes, things of that type. Then all the vegetables that we do are of a horticultural nature, and in addition to the ornamentals. So if you're considering going on to a 4-year school, quite often you'd be faced with a choice of whether to study agronomy or whether to study horticulture. When I went to Tech, I chose horticulture because I had more experience with that, and to me it was more useful and more interesting. It also says that there's some gray areas where crops are grown like an agronomic crop, but it's actually a horticultural crop. And commercial tomatoes are one of the examples that's used for that. Commercial tomatoes are grown for processing in a sort of like a soybean type crop. They're planted and harvested once. It's a machine harvest that they harvest, and they're used for processing with ketchup and salsa and things of that type. Not many of those grown in this area, but there's quite a processing industry of tomatoes out on the eastern shore of the state of Virginia.
What are ornamental crops?
What are ornamental crops? Things that are used for your landscape industry.
So pretty much anything that makes it something that's so pretty.
Yeah, azaleas, roses, rhododendrons, all your floral crops or ornamental crops.
All right.
Okay. As we talk about these types of crops, the term sustainability comes up. And how many of you understand what we mean by sustainability?
Like stability?
Yeah, it has the ability to sustain itself. In other words, it's an ever-going process. It's a guiding principle in crop production in an attempt to make sure it continues. Is that what we're talking about with sustainability? Okay, over the last number of years, we're dealing with changes in plant production because of our efficiency. We are growing more crops of greater dollar value on a smaller percentage of our land. Does that make sense?
We're getting more efficient in terms of growing and sustaining it with less.
Yep. Why? Why are we doing that? How are we able to do that?
Better chemicals, better methods of maintaining them, and just growing them in general.
Yeah. Science is a positive thing. It's been successful, and that's what one of the things that we hope to do. A lot of discussion in today's society about the use of GMO or genetically modified plants. And any of you got any examples of a genetically modified crop that's grown in your area?
We have a lot.
What do we mean by GMO? Go ahead.
we have a lot of corn and soybeans in our area that's Roundup ready.
Right. And that's a perfect example. Do you understand the science behind that, that practice or the use of those plants?
I don't really understand the science behind how they're produced and the way that but I understand why they use them.
Okay. I'll give you just a snapshot, or a quick explanation of the down and dirty on that. Over the last 25 or 30 years of the scientific work that's been done on those crops, soybeans and corn in particular, weed control has been a major problem in the production of those crops. And with the inception of Roundup to control a broad spectrum of green plant tissue, the scientists have developed plant species that were tolerant to Roundup application, specifically corn, soybeans. They're doing some with tobacco, some with cotton, things of that type. Crops that are mass produced. So what they'll do through genetic manipulation, they have increased the tolerance of, say, a soybean plant to an application of Roundup. In other words, Roundup did not kill or stunt, reduce the photosynthetic activity of a soybean. So with that discovery, and they began to produce those seeds and began planting what was a Roundup tolerant soybean. And what they would do, they would plant that bean. Quite often they did it in a sod planting fashion, which was much more advisable. You didn't have the soil erosion, you conserved moisture, it reduced your cost for tillage and things of that type. So they would sod plant these soybean seeds and let them get up to 8 or 10 inches tall, to the point that the weeds were beginning to compete with them a little bit. You'd see the weed above the soybean plant. Then they would apply the Roundup over the top, spray it, and it will, in effect, kill or reduce the vigor of the weed competition that exists, and let the soybeans go on and thrive. And they have worked with this and developed varieties that are very productive, high yielding, and have reduced the production cost and greatly increased the yield of soybeans, as an example. They've also using this for corn production and several other crops. And there's been a lot of discussion or resistance amongst the non-farming community to the use of GMO or Roundup ready crops. And I'm not saying they don't have a point of discussion, but I don't think that it's valid. I don't think they understand the science and understand the cost versus benefits that are there. There's no risk involved with it. Roundup is a very safe material. It's sold over the counter at every store that you pass, every farm store, everything. And it's been used for more than 30 years. Patents gone off of it. That's why you can get so many different brands of glyphosate. And that's what we're talking about. And Roundup is a very unique product in that it's dose dependent. You can use a 1% solution of Roundup and kill the small fine grasses and small weeds that you've got around your house or in your driveway. If you've got something a little tougher, you use a 1.5% solution. You can go on up to about a 3% solution and get most perennial broadleaf. So it's a wonderful tool. Just like all the other chemicals, they're just tools. So, but you know, as we talk about ag production, plant production, the inception of GMOs have greatly enhanced the production and increased the yield. It's reduced our cost per acre to grow a lot of these crops and made them much more economically advantageous. There's a portion in the textbook that talks about subsidy payments, and those we won't talk about them a lot, but at one time the federal government would subsidize certain agricultural crops to make sure that they were cost effective for growers to produce. Tobacco was one of the crops that was subsidized quite extensively, but that program has gone away, and the tobacco production has greatly changed during my lifetime. When I was just a kid, a big tobacco grower in our community would have 3.5, maybe 4 acres, and it was dependent upon the number of acres that he owned or his family owned. And it was the care of tobacco plants. Tobacco was greatly different than it is now. Now the folks that are growing tobacco, well, I've got some neighbors that I saw a couple of weeks ago and asked them how much they were growing. The last time I asked them the question, they had about 115 acres. And he said the other day, he said, well, I'm not real sure. It's somewhere between 325 and 350 acres that 2 brothers are taking care of. So, and they've gone to doing a lot of it mechanically. They're harvesting it all with machines. So, and that's the flue-cured type tobacco. It's not the burley that Dixie's dad grows. So it's quite a different thing. But as we talk about production and trends in production, the size of farms or the number of farms has been greatly reduced over the past 40 to 50 years. And so have our forests, but our forested lands are regaining some acreage, because a lot of the land that is in forestry, forest lands, are being controlled by big conglomerates, and they're replanting a lot of the forested land that's harvested. A lot of reforestation, I think, occurs in the south side area where there's been timber cut. A lot of pines have been replanted, and that accounts for part of this increase in forest lands. But the numbers of farms, the old farmers are just aging out. A lot of the small farms are being gobbled up by real estate, or being swallowed up by a few farms that are actually growing and getting a lot larger. It says U.S. population decreased during the last centuries mainly in urban areas. Rural population has decreased in relative terms from about 60% rural population in 1900 to about 25% in 2000. So the number of folks that are on farms has greatly reduced. Some of this is attributed to what we call urban sprawl. I don't think in our service area or yours either, we are affected by a lot of what we would call urban sprawl. But if you go towards Richmond, Raleigh, Durham, in our area, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, the cities are overtaking a lot of the farmland in rural areas. It's making a huge change in the environment. So, it also spends a few minutes talking about the energy use that is taking place. It says that rising is projected to be about twice as fast as the population. We're talking about the use of energy because of economic expansion and development. I know there's a big point of contention in our immediate area, just north of us. I heard this on the news again this morning, that there were a lot of resistance against against some of the folks because of a gas pipeline that they're wanting to put through. Wasn't there a gas line that's come into the South Boston area over the past few months, or haven't they been working on that? Natural gas line?
That I don't know. And Mandy's not in her classroom, so we can't ask her. And y'all Keysville know anything about that?
They've been working on it some.
Okay. Where are they trying to take that line to? Do you know?
I'm not exactly sure.
Okay. I know I've got a friend that I get produce from north of South Boston there, and I know a year or so ago they had a large area that they were warehousing pipes that they were going to use for that gas line, and I think all that's been put in the ground somewhere, and I'm not sure where it is. But you know, the gas, natural gas is a commodity that is actually a product of plants millions of years ago because of the degradation of plant material, and it's a relatively cheap source of energy. The problem is getting it from where it is being recovered to the places that it's needed. I know that the line there was one line that they put through Patrick County down into to the edge of North Carolina, and it was to serve a big hydroelectric plant that they were using as a source. So, and there's a lot of community resistance as those things go through, and it's part of the threat to the environment. A lot of people are concerned about those, but it's a component of economic development, and that is a cheaper energy product than a lot of other things that we can use. I'm skipping through several of these things here because it's just history, and it's I think we've got other things we need to talk about. In the terms of definitions, there's a term that we talk about or we use. It's called cultivar. Cultivar. Do you have any idea what I mean when I say cultivar?
That's something to do with cultivating, that's all I know.
It is. It's actually short for cultivated variety. We talked about soybeans a while ago. There are, within the family of plants that we call soybeans, there are probably hundreds of different varieties or cultivars. That's all it means. If any of you are familiar with Red Delicious apples, there are probably hundreds of different varieties or cultivars of red delicious apples. Same thing with tomatoes. If I ask you to describe a tomato, some of you may talk about something that's large and red, and some of you may talk about one that's small and yellow. Some of you may talk about one that's a pink. Some of it may be a yellow stripe, cherry tomato, plum tomato, Roma tomato. Those are all different cultivars of tomato. So as we talk about this stuff, you need to be aware that there are different cultivars, which is nothing more than a cultivated variety. It's just terminology that we'll use as we move along. So. As we look at this history, production of plants, what country has the largest, well, I better not go there because I'm not positive that's right. It talks a little bit about China being a major challenge to the world's food supply. Says they have 20% of the world's population and less than 7% of the world's cropland. Says that in 1950 there was about 0.2 of a hectare of land per person. Anybody know what a hectare is?
Isn't it about 2 acres?
It's about 2 acres, right? That's a hectare is a unit of measure that's used in a lot of different areas of the world. Where we talk about acres, they're talking about a hectare. So, that was in 1950 in China. And today it's less than 0.08 per person. So it would be really hard to grow enough food for yourself on the allotment of land that in theory you might have. That's why their fertilizer use is so high, and they've used the fertilizer to the point that they don't get any increase in yield by the increased application. China is a major problem. They're a huge exporter or importer of our foodstuffs. They import more corn and more soybeans than I think most any country from the United States. So, but the volume of agricultural land is shrinking due to urban development.
Wouldn't Sky Gardens potentially fix that?
Do what?
Wouldn't Sky Gardens potentially fix that?
Okay, you mentioned Sky Garden. What are you going to? How are you going to define? What are you going to refer to as a sky garden?
The gardens that occasionally show up on the rooftops of urban sprawls.
Okay. How are you going to gain enough production off of that to be of a benefit?
Well, you could construct housing complexes or just building complexes specifically dedicated to that, and just included in the already spreading urban sprawl.
In theory, I think you have an idea, but in practical, I don't think it works.
Right?
I think you've got a much greater, and this is getting totally off topic, but that's fine. I think you've got a much greater opportunity. And one of the flaws in what you're talking about is the seasonality of it. If you weren't in the southern part of the United States, you would have a dormant season where you couldn't produce anything.
Sure.
Okay, the winter season I would do. But we did a research project here based on a grant that we did with VDAX and Department of Agriculture, growing lettuce and salad crops using the hydroponic system in an old factory building. And we can crop that. We can harvest lettuce about 22 times a year. Where if you did it outdoors, you could only harvest it twice a year. You could harvest that lettuce about every 28 days. And, that offers an awful lot of potential. And if you happen to look into that now, there's a lot of that type of production going on in Chicago and Philadelphia and a lot of the urban cities. They're taking old buildings and using LED lights and hydroponic systems to grow a lot of salad greens and lettuce crops. It's an easy thing to do. It just requires quite an investment. Capital investment to get it started, so.
And to get it done on a much larger scale. Would
Yeah,
be
it's,
very costly.
yeah, it could be. As we talk about energy usage, we were talking about the natural gas. A lot of discussion over the past several years about oil and gasoline that we were importing from the Far East. Are any of you familiar with the technology that they're using now to get natural gas and oil reserves out of some of the more barren lands in the United States? The term fracking mean anything to anybody?
I've heard the term, never heard of it.
Has there any fracking been done in Southside?
No, I think we're too much flatland here. I would think it would
Okay.
be west of y'all,
Okay.
be my guess.
The fracking deal, they drill a well and then they'll pump a mixture of water and gases down in to separate the layers of the bedrock to free up oil and gas reserves, and then they pump that out. It's a major industry up in the upper Midwest and things of that type, and it's greatly reduced our need for petroleum products coming out of the Far East. So that's one of the things that is a lot of talk about. I'm skipping through several things here. One of the things that's been on the forefront of national news over the past number of months is the idea of terrorism. And as we talk about terrorism, we always are, at least in the minds of some of us that are involved with agriculture, are concerned with bioterrorism. Dwayne, the guy that used to be our animal science instructor, was always concerned with the idea of bioterrorism. And what would bioterrorism mean? What would it mean to you?
Like the use of chemical agents in the acts of terrorism.
Yeah, it would, and it would be a major problem to anyone that was dealing with an agricultural commodity. You could inflict a biological agent and really be a real detriment to an agricultural crop. We got to the point now, I guess I'd gotten ahead of myself talking about the GMOs, but it talks about a little bit about the genetically modified organisms. And one of the things that one of the benefits of GMOs is it reduces pesticide runoff. And it's a real asset in that area. Another topic that is discussed in this chapter talks about organic farming. Do any of you have any experience with organic farming? What do we mean by the term organic farming?
No spraying.
Okay. No spraying. That's one of the ideas that is conveyed or projected with when we talk about organic farming. If give me an example of what you're talking about, and then we'll talk about it a little more.
Right, so plants tobacco, you got all your tobacco out there. You don't spray with all your pesticides and herbicides and everything like you would regular tobacco. Just goes off your paid. And a lot of the time, organic goes for a lot more money because it doesn't have all that stuff on it.
Yeah. Well, organic means a little more than just the spraying aspect of it. It means that you don't use commercial fertilizers. You're going to have to use compost or something like that to gain your organic or your nutrients. And you can technically spray a crop and still have it organic, but you've got to be very particular with the type of material that you spray with. You've got to be using natural compounds. In other words, you can spray with sulfur. I grow grapes, and I spray with sulfur several times a year, and not an attempt to be organic, but sulfur is a naturally occurring product, natural in our environment. It's mined and ground and pulverized, and I use an elemental ground sulfur as a fungicide on my grapes. It has fungicidal activity against a disease we call mildew. So I could, in theory, only use sulfur as a fungicide and still sell my grapes as organic as long as I didn't use commercial fertilizer. But it's the idea of organic is an ever encumbering idea, and you're absolutely right that a lot of the products that are sold that are tagged organic are much more expensive. We'll talk about that a little more when we get back together. Again, we're about to run out of time, but in the way of a lab exercise, this morning, once I gained access to the roster on Blackboard, I did send an email to each of you, which should have as an attachment the lab exercise for the plant science class for this week. We were a little bit slack in getting everything started, but this way it is going to be a grocery search, and it should be self-explanatory. You do it on your own. Look at that attachment to that email, and if you've got any questions, either give me a call or send me an email, and I'll try to clarify it for you. But that'll be the assignment this week, and then we'll see how we move forward after that. That's all I got, unless you guys got some questions.
I actually do have one question going back to the bioterrorism thing.
Yep.
The
Okay.
mentions, I suppose you'd pronounce it Ralstonia solanacearum.
Mm-hmm.
And it lists it as both a bacteria and a fungus. Is there a reason it does that? According to the University of North Carolina and NC State and Penn State, it's a bacteria. Does it come with a fungal component of some sort, or why was that listed that way?
It probably has a fungal component, but its primary detriment is the fact that it's a bacteria. It's a highly contagious reactive bacteria, but it probably has a little bit of a fungicidal fungus effect too. So it's a double-barrel deal, and that's the main thing. I'm not that familiar with it. I don't have any experience with it, thank goodness. But that's one of the things that you'll see. Good question, though.
And I also noticed it's talking about this one race as bioterrorism, but I didn't know it's the same pathogen that causes granule wilt in tobacco. So we actually do have it to some extent in the region.
Yep, you will, and it's and you, as we move along, you're gonna find that a lot of this stuff has multiple, facets. You know, we're plants are very varied and versatile. A lot, in some cases, the things that are a detriment in one area are a benefit in another. So that's one of the challenges we have to manage and control them. So, good questions. Yep. Anybody else? I'm done. We'll see you next week.
Okay, fair enough. Bye, everybody. See y'all in animal science in a minute.